The moment Inez Maddox rode into Caldwell, Kansas on a borrowed mule with nothing but a carpetbag, a loaded derringer, and a stubborn heart that refused to quit, she knew her life was about to change in ways she could not yet name. It was the spring of 1878, and the cattle town of Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a bead of sweat on a working man's brow, restless, alive, and always on the verge of something. The main street was a river of mud from 3 days of rain, and the wooden storefronts leaned into each other like old men sharing secrets. Horses were tied at every post, cowboys fresh off the trail were loud in the saloons, and the smell of livestock, tobacco smoke, and frying salt pork hung over everything like a second sky. Inez was 24 years old, dark-haired, brown-eyed, with the kind of quiet determination in her expression that made people look twice. She had come from Wichita with nothing left behind her worth mourning, or so she told herself. Her father had died of a fever in the winter. Her older brother had gambled away what little land they had. She had worked as a seamstress, then as a laundry woman, and when a man in Wichita had tried to collect what he thought she owed him simply because she was a woman alone and therefore fair game, she had decided that staying put was not a strategy she was willing to keep. She slid off the mule in front of the general store, straightened her skirt, and walked inside with her chin level and her eyes open. The store was run by a wide woman named Della Potts who had 3 chins and a warm mouth and who took one look at Inez and decided she liked her. "You looking for work or passing through?" Della asked, not unkindly, while measuring out dried beans from a large sack. "Work," Inez said. "I sew. I cook. I can keep books if the numbers are simple." Della tilted her head. "My girl left in February to marry a preacher in Abilene. I need someone to help manage the dry goods and keep the ledger. Room is above the store. It's small, but it's dry." "I will take it," Inez said, and just like that she had a foothold in Caldwell. She spent her first week learning the store, learning the rhythms of the town, learning who was who. She learned that the marshal was a man named Hargrove who drank too much and smiled too little. She learned that the saloon across the street was called the Red Dust, and that it was where the real business of the town got conducted after sundown. She learned that the cattle drives coming up from Texas meant that every few weeks Caldwell swelled like a river after rain with cowboys and drovers and gamblers and all the commerce that followed men with wages and thirst. She also learned on her 4th day about Vernon Langston. She heard his name before she saw him. 2 cowboys came into the store to buy tobacco and rope, and one of them said to the other, "Langston's herd is 3 days out. You know what that means?" And the other one grinned and said, "It means the Red Dust better stock an extra barrel." And they both laughed in that particular way men laugh when they admire someone without wanting to admit it. Inez asked Della about him later. In that careful way she asked about things she was genuinely curious about, which was different from the way she asked about things she merely needed to know. Della leaned on the counter and got the look of someone settling in to tell a story. Vernon Langston runs one of the finest cattle operations in the territory. His ranch is down in the Indian Territory, just over the Kansas line, which means he is technically operating in a space that most men would not dare. He's got a mixed crew, which around here makes some people nervous, and he doesn't much care that it does. He is 32. He is not married. He is not easy. "What does that mean, not easy?" Inez asked. Della smiled. "It means he doesn't give himself away cheap." The herd arrived 2 days earlier than anyone expected, which was apparently the kind of thing Vernon Langston did, arriving before you had finished preparing for him. Inez heard the cattle before she saw them, that low rolling thunder of hooves and the distant whistle of the drovers, and then Main Street was suddenly alive with the kind of organized chaos that a cattle drive brings in its wake. She was standing in the doorway of the general store when she first saw him. He was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark hat that had been through weather and showed it. His horse was a deep roan, well-muscled and responsive under his hands. He rode with the unhurried ease of a man who had spent more of his life on a horse than off one, and he was directing his men with economy. A word here, a gesture there, eyes moving constantly over his herd with the focused attention of someone who knew the value of what was in his care. He was not handsome in the conventional way that made women flutter in parlors. He was something more complicated than that. He had a strong jaw and dark brows, and a mouth that looked like it knew how to be serious but might, under certain conditions, know how to be something else. There were lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into sun. His hands, even at this distance, looked capable. He turned his head, and for just a moment, across the width of the muddy Main Street, his eyes met hers. Inez looked away first, not because she was embarrassed, but because she was honest with herself about what she felt in that moment, which was something warm and inconvenient, and she was not yet ready to sit with it. She went back inside and started organizing the bolt fabrics. Vernon came into the general store the next morning. He came alone, which she would later learn was unusual. He generally sent one of his men for supplies. But he came himself this time, and she did not know, not yet, that it was because someone had told him about the dark-haired woman working at Della's store. He stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dimmer light inside, and Inez was behind the counter entering figures into the ledger, and she looked up, and there he was. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and even with a Texas edge to it, not rough exactly, but worn smooth in a particular way. "Good morning," she said. "What can I help you with?" He came to the counter and set down a list written on the back of a scrap of brown paper. She looked at it. Flour, sugar, salt, dried beans, coffee, axle grease, needles, thread, a practical list, a working list. "I can have most of this ready this afternoon," she said. "The needles and thread I have right now. What weight of thread are you needing?" "Heavy," he said, "for canvas and leather repair." She moved to the thread display and selected the appropriate weight without hesitating, and she felt him watching her, not in the way that made her want to step back, but in the way that meant he was paying attention. "You're new here," he said. 3 weeks, she confirmed, setting the thread on the counter. "Where from?" "Wichita originally, before that Ohio." He nodded slowly. "Long way from Ohio." "Yes," she agreed, "it is." There was a small silence that was not uncomfortable, which was already unusual. "Vernon Langston," he said, and extended his hand across the counter. She took it. His grip was firm and brief and warm, and she noticed all 3 things. Inez Maddox. He paid for the thread and the needles then and there, and told her he would send a man for the rest of the order in the afternoon. He put his hat back on and turned to go, and at the door he paused. "Miss Maddox," he said, without turning back, "is there a place in this town worth eating supper that isn't the saloon? Mrs. Garfield runs a boarding house on Elm Street. She serves supper at 6. The food is plain but honest." He turned just enough that she could see the edge of something that might have been a smile. "Thank you," he said, and left. Della appeared from the back room approximately 4 seconds later, which told Inez she had been listening. "Well," Della said. "Well, nothing," Inez said, and went back to the ledger. But she ate supper at Mrs. Garfield's that evening, which she had not done before, having usually eaten upstairs in her room. She told herself it was because she was tired of eating alone with only her own thoughts for company. She sat at the long table with 6 other boarders, and there, at the far end, was Vernon Langston. He saw her the moment she came in. She saw him see her. She sat down at the near end and talked to the woman beside her, a widow named Frances who was passing through on her way to visit her daughter in Colorado. But halfway through the meal, when the conversation had spread itself around the table and reorganized, she found herself answering a question Vernon had asked, something about whether she had been to the Indian Territory. And then he was answering something she had asked about the nature of the cattle business. And before the pie was served, they were talking in that particular way where you are not aware of how much time has passed. He told her about his ranch, which he called the Crossfire because it sat at the junction of 2 dry creek beds that ran in wet seasons. He had built it up over 8 years, starting with 100 head and working outward from there. He had a crew of 12, including 2 Cherokee men who had been with him from the beginning, and a young Mexican vaquero named Luis who was 17 and learning everything fast. "You don't run a typical operation," she said, meaning the mixed crew, meaning the location and the territory. "No," he said simply, "I don't." "Does that cause trouble?" He considered this honestly. "Sometimes," he said. "There are men who don't like that I pay my men the same regardless of who they are, and there are men who don't like that I do business with ranchers in the territory who are not white. Those men and I don't generally get along well, and I don't find I lose sleep over it." She looked at him steadily. "Good," she said. That was when something shifted just slightly in his expression, like a door opening a crack. He walked her back to the general store afterward, which was a short walk, and they stood for a moment on the boardwalk in the warm spring evening with the sound of the Red Dust Saloon rolling out on the air. "I'll be in Caldwell another 4 days," he said, waiting on payment from the buyer and restocking before the drive back. "4 days," she said. "Would you be willing to walk with me tomorrow evening? There's a stretch along the creek east of town I've been told is worth seeing." She looked at him. She thought about all the reasons this was complicated, all the warnings she had given herself since arriving in Caldwell about keeping her head clear and her priorities straight. "Yes," she said, "I would." The walk along the creek was the first of 4 evenings they spent together during those 4 days, and each one was different from the last. The first was careful, exploratory, 2 people testing the weight of the conversation between them. The second was easier, warmer, with more laughter and longer stretches of the kind of talk that goes deep without quite meaning to. On the 3rd evening, he told her about his brother, who had died of a gunshot wound 6 years ago in a dispute over water rights that should never have reached that point. And his voice went quiet in a particular way when he talked about it. And she told him about her father dying in the cold and her brother's failures, and the long road from Ohio to Kansas. And neither of them tried to fill the other's silences with comfort that would have been hollow. On the 4th evening they walked back through the last of the sunset, and he stopped her at the edge of town where the creek path met the main road, and he turned to face her. "I don't want to leave tomorrow without saying something," he said. "Then say it," she said. "I am not a man who says things easily. I want you to know that so you understand what it means that I'm saying this." He looked at her with those steady dark eyes. "I would like to come back to Caldwell for reasons other than the cattle market. I would like to come back to see you." The spring air smelled of grass and wood smoke and the distant low moan of cattle settling for the night. "I would like that," she said. He came back 6 weeks later, which was faster than the cattle schedule required, and he was straightforward about the fact that the visit was for her and not for the market. He rode in on a Tuesday morning and was at the door of the general store before she had finished opening up, and Della took one look at his face and another at Inez's face, and quietly invented a reason to be in the back room. They sat outside on the bench in front of the store in the morning light and talked for 2 hours, and then he helped her take in a delivery of flour sacks that afternoon because the delivery man was short-handed, and they ate supper again at Mrs. Garfield's, and afterward he brought her a small wrapped package. She opened it at the table, and inside was a folded square of soft leather, very fine, the kind used for gloves, and on it someone had done a small, careful piece of decorative stitching in blue and gold thread. "One of my men's wife makes them," he said. "She is Tsalagi, what most people call Cherokee. Her name is Hannah Bird, and she is the finest needleworker I have ever seen. I described you to her, and she said you sounded like someone who would appreciate the work itself more than the object." Inez ran her thumb over the stitching. It was precise and beautiful and told a small story in pattern that she could only partly read. "She was right," Inez said softly. "Please tell her I said so." He was watching her with that steady attentiveness that she had come to associate specifically with him, as though she was something worth the effort of genuine observation. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask." "Would you be willing to come and see the Crossfire?" She looked up. "Your ranch?" "Yes." "I know it's an unconventional invitation, and I know there are proprieties that—" "When?" she asked. He blinked, which was one of the few times she had seen him caught off guard. "I was thinking in the next few weeks, if you can get away from the store, I would bring one of my men's wives as a chaperone, if that would make it more appropriate." "Ask Della," she said. "If she can spare me for 4 days, I'll go." Della could spare her. Della was, in fact, so enthusiastic about this development that she gave Inez 3 days off without being asked, and pressed a small jar of dried lavender into her hands as she was leaving, on the grounds that it would make her bag smell nice. The ride down to the Crossfire took 2 days, traveling south from Caldwell across the Kansas line into the Indian Territory, through a landscape that shifted and opened and became something wider and older, and full of a kind of beauty that Inez had not expected. The territory in the late spring was green after the rains, with rolling grass that moved in the wind like something breathing, and the sky above it all was enormous in a way that felt almost personal, as though it had been arranged specifically to make you feel both very small and very alive. Vernon rode beside her on the roan, and his man Thomas rode behind with Thomas's wife, Adela, who was good company, quick-witted and observant, and who told Inez quietly on the second day of riding that she had never seen Mr. Langston look at the landscape as little as he was looking at it on this trip. "He keeps looking at you instead," Adela said, without making it into something dramatic, just a fact. Inez smiled at the horizon. "I noticed," she said. The Crossfire was not what she expected, and it was better than what she expected, and it was also harder than what she expected. The main house was solid and plain, built of local stone and seasoned timber, with a wide porch that faced west to catch the evening air. There were outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, corrals with good fencing. The land around it was broad and grass-rich and crossed in 2 places by the dry creek beds that gave the place its name. But it was also isolated in a way that Caldwell was not, and when she stood on the porch on the first morning and looked out at the distance between her and the nearest other habitation, she understood something about the life Vernon Langston had built here, something about the weight of it and the beauty of it and the loneliness of it. His crew was there, all 12 of them, and they were polite in the way of people who are deciding about someone new, cautious without being cold. The 2 Cherokee men, Daniel and James Sixkeller, were brothers, quiet and watchful, with a dry humor that came out slowly. Louis, the young vaquero, was 17 and barely containing his enthusiasm about everything, and his openness was a relief after the more measured introductions. Hannah Bird was everything her needlework had suggested, a woman of maybe 40 with a composed face and observant eyes, and when she shook Inez's hand, she held it just a moment longer than necessary, and then nodded once as if confirming something. Vernon showed her the ranch the way a person shows something they love, without performing the love but also without hiding it. He showed her the cattle, the grazing rotation he used, the way he had planned the water access across the land. He showed her the southern boundary where the land rose slightly, and you could see 3 territories worth of sky at once. He showed her the spot where he intended to eventually build a larger barn. On the second evening they were alone on the porch after supper, the crew having retired. Adela and Thomas settled in their own small cabin near the bunkhouse, and the night was warm and insect-loud and full of stars in a way that Kansas towns never were, because out here there was nothing to dim them. "Do you like it?" he asked, not performatively. He genuinely wanted to know. "I love it," she said honestly. "It is one of the most beautiful pieces of land I have ever seen." "It is a hard life," he said. "I'm not going to pretend it isn't. The winters are long and the work doesn't stop and the territory has its complications." "I know hard lives," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark. Then he said, "I think you know what I'm moving toward, Inez." "I think I do," she said. "I want to say it plainly because I think you're a person who deserves plain speaking." "I am," she said. He turned and looked at her directly, the way he did everything. "I am falling in love with you. I have been since about the 3rd sentence of the first evening at Mrs. Garfield's table, and it has only gotten more certain since. I am not asking you for anything tonight, but I wanted you to know where I stand, because it seemed dishonest not to say it." The night breathed around them. A coyote called somewhere far out in the dark, and the cattle shifted in the corral, and the stars held their positions as they always did. "Vernon," she said quietly, "yes, I am falling in love with you too. I have been trying to be sensible about it. And I'm not very good at it." He reached over in the dark and found her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and he covered it with his own. And they sat like that for a long time without saying anything else, which was its own kind of conversation. She went back to Caldwell the next day as planned, because she had her work and her responsibilities, and because neither of them was the kind of person to rush the thing that was growing between them without giving it the space to root properly. But the letters started that week. She had not known he was a letter writer. She would not have guessed it from the economy of his speech, the way he said precisely what was needed and not a word more. But his letters were different from his speech, not effusive, not romantic in the sentimental way of dime novels, but thorough. He wrote the way he looked at things, with full attention. He told her what was happening at the crossfire, what the cattle were doing, what Lewis had learned that week, what the sky looked like on a particular morning. He wrote about his plans, his worries, a problem with the eastern fence line, a deal he was negotiating with a rancher in the territory that he thought was fair but that would require careful handling. And he wrote about her. Carefully, plainly. He wrote that he thought about her when he was riding and when the day was quiet. He wrote that he had tried to describe her to Daniel Sixkiller, who had said that a man who spends that much time describing a woman has already made up his mind. He wrote that Daniel was probably right. Inez wrote back in kind. She told him about the town, about Della's stories, about a dispute over a bolt of fabric that had involved 3 women and a great deal of controlled outrage. She wrote about what she was reading, an old copy of Jane Austen she had found in someone's donated goods, and about the creek behind the store and the way it smelled on rainy evenings. She wrote about Ohio, the things she missed about it, the way the seasons moved differently there. She wrote about her father, more than she had told him in person, because writing made it easier to say the complicated things. And she wrote in one letter that she was happy in a way she had not been in a long time, and that it frightened her a little and that she thought he should know. He wrote back, "Don't be frightened. I'll be careful with it." He came back to Caldwell in August, and this time he stayed a full week, and this time there was no uncertainty between them about what they were to each other. He met her each morning before the store opened, and they walked together, and he helped her with the heavy work when it was needed, and they ate supper together every evening, and the town of Caldwell watched and formed its opinions and mostly, though not without exception, approved. The exceptions were 2 men, a cattle buyer named Aldridge and a local land speculator named Crane, who had each in their own way thought that a woman alone in a new town was an opportunity of a certain kind, and who did not appreciate finding that opportunity removed by a man who looked at Inez Maddox with the particular focus of someone who has already decided. Aldridge said something unpleasant about it to Vernon directly one afternoon in front of the Red Dust, something about the kind of woman who works in a dry goods store and comes from nowhere, and Vernon looked at him for a long, quiet moment and then said, in the same even voice he used for everything, "I'll ask you to walk in a different direction." And the tone of it was sufficient to end the conversation. He told Inez about it that evening. She was not surprised. "Men like Aldridge think that a woman without a husband is a question awaiting their answer," she said, and her voice had a controlled heat in it that he had not heard before. "He won't say it again," Vernon said. "I know," she said, "but there will always be another Aldridge." "Yes," he said honestly, "there will." They looked at each other across the table. "Is it something you could live with?" she asked, and she meant something larger than just Aldridge, something about the whole complicated shape of the life she could see being offered. "Is what something I could live with? The fact that this world is not going to make it simple." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his eyes steady. "Inez, nothing in my life that has been worth anything has been simple. I built my ranch on land that people told me was too remote and too complicated. I hire men that people told me I shouldn't. I run my operation the way I think is right, not the way it's easiest. None of that is simple, but it's mine and I'm proud of it." He paused. "What I'm asking you would not be simple either, but it would be mine in a way nothing else has been." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You haven't actually asked me yet." "No," he said, "I haven't." He came back to Caldwell in September. He rode in on a Thursday afternoon and came directly to the general store, and Della took one look at his expression and said, without preamble, "She's in the back taking inventory." He walked back through the curtain into the storage room, and Inez looked up from the crates she was counting and saw him standing there with his hat in his hands and something in his face that was both certain and vulnerable in a way she had not seen before. "You're early," she said. "I couldn't wait any longer," he said. "I've been thinking about this for 6 months, and I've decided that thinking about it is the same as waiting, and I'm done waiting." She set down her pencil. He crossed the room to her, and she was aware of the close air of the storage room, the smell of flour and tobacco and the faint sweetness of dried apples, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her the way he always looked at her, like she was worth the full effort of his attention. "Inez Maddox," he said, "will you marry me?" The word came up from somewhere deep and sure in her, the way the right things always did. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Vernon, I will." He kissed her then for the first time, and it was not tentative. It was the kiss of a man who had been thinking about it for 6 months and had thought carefully enough about it to get it right. Della's voice came through the curtain. "I'm going to need someone to help me hang the order sign." They pulled apart, and Inez was laughing and Vernon's mouth was curved in the full version of the smile she had been seeing pieces of since the first morning in the store. "I think we've been overheard," he said. "Della hears everything," Inez said. "She has the ears of a barn cat." They were married in November of 1878, in the small church on the edge of Caldwell, in a ceremony that was brief and honest, and attended by Della Potts and Mrs. Garfield and Thomas and Adela, and having ridden up from the territory specially for it, Daniel and James Sixkiller and Hannah Bird and Lewis, and several more of the Crossfire crew. The minister was a young man named Fellows who was new to the territory, and who seemed genuinely moved by the ceremony, possibly because both Vernon and Inez spoke their vows in a way that made clear they meant every syllable. Afterward there was a supper at Mrs. Garfield's, the long table fully extended and crowded with mismatched chairs, and there was a fiddle player from somewhere who played without being asked, and there was something light and warm and entirely itself about the evening, the way evenings are when the people in them are exactly where they are supposed to be. Inez wore a dress she had made herself from a deep blue wool that she had spent 3 evenings choosing from Della's stock. She had done the collar in a simple lace she had worked herself, and Hannah Bird had gifted her a belt of soft leather with that same intricate stitching in it, blue and gold, the same pattern as the square she had been given before, and she had understood that the pattern meant something, and that it was something given with intention and care. Vernon wore his good coat and a clean shirt and his best hat, and he looked, in Inez's honest opinion, like a man who made sense. They rode south the next morning, the two of them together, toward the Crossfire and whatever came next. The first winter at the Crossfire was hard, as Vernon had said it would be, and Inez found her footing in it slowly and without flinching. She was not a woman who had ever imagined herself on a ranch in the Indian Territory, but she was also not a woman who had ever been very attached to the life she had imagined. She had learned early that the life you imagined was mostly a rough sketch, and the life you actually lived was the full painting, more complicated and more beautiful, and containing many colors you did not expect. She organized the house, which had been clean but spare, and made it warmer without making it fussy. She learned what the crew needed, how to anticipate the demands of the cattle schedule, how to manage the supplies with the particular care required when the nearest town was 2 days' ride. She learned the land, its moods and its silences, the way the dry creek beds came to life after rain, The way the wind came down from the north in January with a particular edge that meant business. Hannah Bird taught her things. Not explicitly, not with lessons, but by doing them alongside her, showing her which plants were useful for what, teaching her the particular knot used for certain repairs, explaining the way the weather moved in this part of the territory in a way that was more accurate than any almanac. Inez received this knowledge with the seriousness it deserved, and Hannah, in her composed and watchful way, seemed to appreciate that. Daniel Sixkiller, who had at first been the most reserved about her, came around by February. The turning point was a Sunday morning when one of the horses was ill and the usual methods were not working, and Daniel had exhausted his ideas, and Inez, drawing on a distant memory of something her father had told her about horses in Ohio, suggested something different, and it worked. Daniel looked at her afterward with a new kind of regard and said simply, "Good thinking," and after that they were on solid ground. And Vernon was, as she was discovering, a man who was easier to know at close range than at a distance. The economy of his speech was not coldness. She had known that from early on, but seeing it in the dailiness of a shared life confirmed it in a new way. He was attentive in all the ways that mattered. He came in from the range cold and tired and still made the effort. He listened when she talked. He asked her opinion on the ranch decisions and meant it as a genuine question, not a performance of consideration. He was not perfect. He had a stubbornness about him that was occasionally frustrating, and a tendency to take on other people's problems that sometimes left him too wrung out for his own. But his imperfections were the kind that made sense alongside a person rather than working against them. She loved him in a way that surprised her with its depth, not because she had not expected to love him, but because the daily reality of the love was so different from anything she had imagined love to be. It was not the love of the dime novels she had read, all storm and drama and misunderstanding. It was steadier than that, warmer, more like a good fire than a lightning strike, the kind that heats a whole room and not just the place directly in front of it. In the spring of 1879, she discovered she was expecting their first child. She told him on a morning in March when the first real warmth of the year was in the air. The dry creek beds were running thin but actually running, and he had just come in from the early morning check on the cattle, still in his coat, smelling of cold air and horses. She set his coffee on the table and sat down across from him and said, "I need to tell you something." He looked up immediately, the way he always did when her tone changed. "We are going to have a child," she said. "By my calculation, around October." He was still for a moment. In that way he went still when something touched him deeply, and then something came into his face that she had not quite seen before, something unguarded and luminous and a little undone. "Inez," he said. "Yes," she said. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her hands in his, and she could feel that they were slightly trembling, which for a man whose hands were always steady was its own kind of eloquence. "Are you well?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "I'm well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, otherwise quite well." He pressed her hands. He looked at her with everything he was thinking visible on his face in a way it rarely was, all of it at once, the love and the wonder and the weight of responsibility and the joy. "I am so glad," he said simply. "I am so very glad." The summer of 1879 was one of the hottest in territory memory, and running a ranch through it was demanding in ways that tested everyone. There were days when the work was grinding and the heat was oppressive, and the logistics of keeping cattle, horses, and 12 men alive and functional through a territory summer felt like a full occupation in itself. And there was the matter of the land dispute. A man named Cole Whitfield had come into the territory in the spring, backed by money from somewhere back east, and he had his eye on the grazing land east of the Crossfire's boundary. The land in question was territory land, not formally deeded to anyone, but it had been used informally by the Sixkiller family and their community for a generation, and it was also land that Vernon's eastern cattle rotation depended on. Whitfield was smooth and legally sophisticated in a way that frontier land disputes usually weren't, and he had filed papers in the federal land office that would, if approved, give him title to a substantial piece of territory that would effectively cut the Crossfire off from its eastern water access. Vernon rode to Caldwell to see the territorial land agent in July, and came back 3 days later with a set of papers and a serious expression that Inez recognized as the particular combination of controlled anger and determination. "What did you find out?" she asked. He spread the papers on the table. "Whitfield's filing is legitimate in its form, but there are two things working against him. First, there's a use rights claim that Daniel's family has, which is not formal deed but which the territorial courts have, in at least 2 previous cases I found record of, recognized as having legal weight. Second, the water access question makes his claim technically a public nuisance, which gives us grounds to object." "But," she asked, because there was clearly a but the land agent in Caldwell is sympathetic to Whitfield's operation. I think money has moved. And the territorial court is in Fort Smith, which is a long way to carry a case." Inez sat across from him and looked at the papers. She was 7 months along by this point, and the heat was difficult, but her mind was clear. "Does Whitfield know the use rights precedent?" she asked. "I don't think so. His lawyer is from St. Louis, and I don't think he's done his territory research." "Then file the use rights claim before he finds out. Make the filing in Fort Smith directly, not through the Caldwell land agent, and document the water access situation with a surveyor's report. Physical evidence is harder to buy than an agent's opinion." He looked at her across the table with that look. "What?" she said. "I married an exceptionally clear thinker," he said. "You married a woman who grew up helping her father manage a property dispute with a neighbor who had more money and less right," she said. "This is not unfamiliar territory." They filed directly in Fort Smith. They got the surveyor's report. Daniel Sixkiller wrote a formal statement of his family's use rights that Vernon had a lawyer in Fort Smith review and refine. It took most of the late summer, accomplished largely through letters and one trip to Fort Smith that Vernon made alone, and came back from looking exhausted but satisfied. The claim was upheld in September. Whitfield's filing was denied on the grounds of the existing use rights and the water access conflict. He left the territory shortly after, taking his money and his smooth manner with him. Vernon came home from Caldwell with the news on a September evening when the air had finally broken from the summer heat and the territory was beginning its long, golden turning toward autumn. Inez met him on the porch, one hand resting on the rounding of her belly, and he came up the steps and kissed her and said against her hair, "It's settled. Whitfield's gone." She exhaled a breath she had been holding for 2 months. "Good," she said. "Now come inside. Adela made a stew." Their son was born on the 14th of October, 1879, delivered by Hannah Bird in the main house bedroom, while Vernon wore out the boards of the porch outside. He was a solid, healthy boy, round-faced and dark-haired, and when Vernon first held him, the expression on his face was entirely beyond what words were built to contain. "What are you going to name him?" Adela asked from the doorway. Vernon and Inez looked at each other. "Robert," Inez said. "For my father." Vernon nodded slowly. "Robert James Langston," he said, including his brother's name as the middle name, and he said it in a way that made clear it was exactly right. The year that followed was one of the fullest and hardest and best of Inez's life. Having a child on a working ranch in the Indian Territory in 1880 was not a simple thing. The work did not stop because there was a baby. The demands of the Crossfire did not adjust themselves around the schedule of a nursing infant. She managed it because she was a practical woman, and because she had help from Adela and Hannah, and eventually from the crew, who turned out to a man to be inexplicably devoted to the small, round-faced boy who had appeared in their midst, and who regarded all 12 of them with the same interested, solemn gaze. Louis, who was now 18 and had grown into someone quieter and more skilled than the eager boy of 2 years ago, was particularly devoted. He would sit with Robert in the evenings and talk to him in Spanish, and Robert would watch him with enormous attention, and it was generally agreed that Robert was going to grow up knowing more Spanish than English. Vernon was, to no one's surprise, a father who paid full attention to his son. He was not a demonstrative man in public, never had been, but in the private space of the house, he was entirely present with the child, patient, and engaged in a way that continued to move Inez each time she witnessed it. There was one evening in the spring of 1880, when Robert was 5 months old and had been difficult all day, fussy in the way of babies whose needs you cannot quite identify. And by evening Inez was tired and frustrated, and Vernon had just come in from a long day of fence repair and was tired himself. She handed the baby to him more out of desperation than strategy, and he took Robert without comment and walked him on the porch in the warm evening air. And within 10 minutes the baby was quiet, his small dark head tucked under Vernon's chin, both of them looking out at the last of the sunset over the western grass. Inez stood in the doorway and looked at them, and the feeling that moved through her was so large it required a moment to identify. It was gratitude, pure, specific, unhurried gratitude, for the man on the porch and the child in his arms and the land around them and the life that had come to her out of the narrow and improbable road from Ohio to Kansas to this place, this October warm evening, this particular version of her own existence. She went out and stood beside him, and he put his free arm around her, and the three of them stood on the porch of the Crossfire in the last of the light, and it was, in its own plain way, perfect. The Crossfire continued to grow through 1880 and 1881. Vernon extended the cattle operation southward, negotiating a grazing agreement with a Chickasaw rancher named Amos Bird Tail that gave him access to a substantial stretch of rich summer pasture. The agreement was good for both operations, and conducted with the straightforwardness that characterized everything Vernon did in business. No tricks, no asymmetry, a fair deal made in good faith. Lewis had by 1881 become an indispensable member of the crew, and Vernon had formally promoted him to segundo, second in command after himself, which caused some murmuring in certain quarters, and caused Vernon to be unmoved by the murmuring, which was consistent with his general approach to certain quarters. Inez had, by this point, become genuinely knowledgeable about the cattle operation, not in the same physical way as the crew, but in the management and financial sense. She kept the Crossfire's books, handled the correspondence with buyers and suppliers, managed the supply rotation with a precision that eliminated waste and saved the operation real money. Vernon relied on her judgment in these things entirely, not as a courtesy, but because it genuinely was better judgment than his. There were people in the territory and in Caldwell who found this arrangement unusual, a wife with real authority in a business operation. Vernon met this observation with the same expression he brought to all such observations, a flat, slightly patient look that communicated his indifference to the opinion while remaining technically civil. "You don't have to defend it," Inez told him once, when he recounted a conversation with a buyer who had been pointed in his commentary about women in commerce. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I choose to." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you're my wife," he said, as though this were the entire and complete explanation, which, the way he said it was. In the late spring of 1881, a new complication arrived in the form of a young woman named Clara Reeves, who came to the Crossfire on a borrowed horse looking for work. She was 20 years old, from somewhere in Texas, and she had a story that Inez could read between the lines of even if Clara herself did not tell all of it. A bad situation left behind, something frightening enough to send a young woman alone across open territory to knock on a stranger's door. Inez hired her on the spot. Not as a charity, she was clear about that, but as a genuine hire for the help she needed in the house and with Robert, who was now 18 months old and investigating everything at ground level and requiring constant attention. Vernon, who came in from the range that evening to find a new person at his supper table, raised his eyebrows at Inez. "Clara Reeves," Inez said. "She'll be helping with Robert and the house. I should have hired help 6 months ago and I was being stubborn." Vernon looked at Clara, who was clearly braced for this evaluation, and said simply, "Welcome to the Crossfire, Miss Reeves," and went to wash up for supper. Clara, who had apparently been expecting a harder reception, let out a small breath. Robert, who had been watching her from across the room, chose this moment to walk purposefully toward her and offer her a wooden spool he had been carrying for 2 hours, which was his way of establishing a relationship. She became part of the household, quietly, practically, without drama. She was good with Robert, patient and playful, and she helped Inez with the house in a way that gave Inez back several hours of each day that she had not realized how much she needed. She was also, Inez gradually understood, watching Luis Salazar from across the room with a regularity that suggested it was not accidental. Luis, for his part, was developing an elaborate and entirely transparent system of being in the vicinity of the house at times that happened to coincide with Clara being outdoors. Inez mentioned this to Vernon one evening. "I know," he said. "Should we be concerned?" Vernon considered. "Luis is 18. He's a good man, honest and hardworking. Clara seems to be a good woman in difficult circumstances. I think we should not interfere and let it go the way it goes. And if it goes badly, then we'll manage it, but I don't think it will go badly." It did not go badly. By the autumn of 1881, Luis and Clara were openly walking out together on Sunday evenings, and Luis had spoken to Vernon with the formal seriousness of a young man who intends everything he says, and Clara had spoken to Inez with a frankness that Inez found deeply appealing. "I'm not walking into anything without my eyes open," Clara told her. "I've learned that lesson, but Luis is. He is genuinely kind. I didn't think I trusted that. I'm finding I do." Inez thought of a man with a list written on brown paper who had paid for thread and said thank you, of a dark porch and a hand found in the dark. "Trust it," she said. "When it's real, you can tell." The winter of 1881 brought snow to the territory in a way it had not in several years, and the Crossfire battened down and managed it the way it managed everything else, by preparation and stubbornness, and the particular resilience of people who have chosen a hard life, because it is also an honest one. Inez discovered in December that she was expecting again. This one announced itself with more energy than Robert had, a tiredness that was different in character, a particular sensitivity to the smell of coffee that she normally loved. She told Vernon in the kitchen on a cold morning while the snow was coming down outside, and his reaction was the same as it had been the first time, that moment of stillness, that luminous undoing. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Beyond what I can account for," he said. She reached across the kitchen table and took his hand. He turned his palm up and held hers properly, the way he had on the porch at the Crossfire that first visit, and outside the snow came down, and inside the stove was warm, and in the next room Robert was talking to himself about something in the mixed English and Spanish that had become his particular language. The spring of 1882 brought change in several directions. The cattle market was shifting. The great trail drives that had defined the 1870s were already feeling the pressure of the expanding railroad, which was reaching further into Texas and making the long drives less necessary and less profitable. Vernon was watching this carefully and thinking forward. He had begun corresponding with a man in Kansas City about the possibility of a more direct cattle contract with a processor there, one that would bypass the Caldwell market entirely and give the Crossfire more stability. "The trail drives are not going to last another 10 years, he told Inez one evening, going over the market figures she had laid out. "The railroads are going to make them obsolete. Then we need to be ahead of it," she said. "Yes, the Kansas City contract would give us a guaranteed price and a guaranteed market, lower per head than the Caldwell peak but consistent, and consistency might be worth more than peaks in a changing market." "Show me the numbers again," she said. He spread the figures between them on the table, and they went through them together the way they did everything, with full honesty and the willingness to be wrong. And by the end of the evening, they had a position they agreed on. He went to Kansas City in April, leaving Thomas in charge and leaving Inez in her 8th month of pregnancy with the Crossfire running smoothly under her management. He did not want to go, she could tell, and she made him. Go, she said. This contract matters. I have Hannah and Adela and Clara. I have Thomas. I have 12 capable men. Go to Kansas City and come back with a deal. You'll send word immediately immediately, she promised. He kissed her at the gate the morning he left, holding her carefully with full attention, his forehead against hers for a moment. I love you, he said. I know, she said. Go. He went, and she ran the Crossfire for 3 weeks, and their second child arrived on the last day of April with Hannah Bird in attendance again, and this time it was a girl. A daughter, small and perfect and very loud. With Vernon's dark brows and Inez's brown eyes and opinions, she was already communicating clearly. Vernon arrived back from Kansas City 4 days after the birth, with the contract signed and good terms secured, and Inez met him on the porch with the bundle in her arms, and he was off his horse before it had properly stopped moving. A girl, she said. She has been expressing herself vigorously. He took her from Inez's arms and looked down at this new person with the full force of his attention, and the expression on his face was, as it always was in these moments, entirely beyond what she had words for. What are we calling her? He said softly. Eleanor, Inez said. If you agree. Eleanor, he said, as though tasting the name. The baby looked up at him with the focused attention of a person who has just arrived somewhere and is assessing the situation. Yes, he said. That's right. Robert, now 2.5, was brought out to meet his sister by Clara, and he regarded her with the same solemn assessment he brought to everything new, and then patted her blanket very carefully with one small hand, which seemed to constitute his approval. 1982 became 1883, and the Crossfire continued its expansion in the new direction Vernon had mapped. The Kansas City contract proved as stable as he had hoped, and he structured a second agreement by the end of the year that gave the operation a dual market position, which protected it against the fluctuations that were already beginning to hurt the trail-dependent operations. He also, that year, hired 2 more men and built the larger barn he had been planning since before Inez arrived. The barn went up in a week of communal work in September. The whole crew and several neighboring ranchers and some of the Sixkiller family community. And afterward there was a supper on the new barn floor that was one of the best evenings Inez could remember, full of people she had come to love in the way you love the people who have shared the particular work of building something real. Louis and Clara, married in October of 1883. The ceremony was at the Crossfire itself, in the open air between the house and the new barn, with the territory autumn golden around them, and it was presided over by a minister who had recently established himself in the nearby settlement, and who performed the ceremony with appropriate dignity and genuine warmth. Inez stood with Vernon and watched Louis stand with his hands, and his heart entirely open, while Clara walked toward him looking like a woman who had found what she had not quite believed still existed, and she leaned slightly into Vernon's arm and felt his hand come to rest at the small of her back. And she thought that this was what it looked like when things went right, not because everything was easy, but because the right people found each other and chose each other and kept choosing. The year 1884 brought a full and complex life to the Crossfire and to everyone in it. Robert turned 5 and began what passed for schooling in that part of the territory, Inez teaching him in the mornings from the small collection of books she had assembled over the years. Eleanor was 2 and was, in everyone's assessment, the most determined small person they had encountered, opinionated and joyful in equal measure, with a particular attachment to the horses that gave Vernon both pride and mild terror. Hannah Bird fell ill in the spring of 1884, not severely but enough to slow her, and Inez spent a portion of every day with her during her recovery, sitting with her in the mornings, bringing food, talking and also sitting in comfortable quiet. In one of those quiet mornings, Hannah said without preamble, "You were what was missing here, not because of anything you do, though you do much, but because of what you are." Inez looked at her. "What do I need to say to that?" she asked. "Nothing," Hannah said. "I said it because it's true and because you should know." Hannah recovered through the summer and was back to her full capacity by fall, which was a relief to everyone, most particularly to Daniel and James Sixkiller, who had both been attempting to hide the depth of their worry about their mother figure with varying and largely unsuccessful degrees of concealment. Inez and Vernon's third child arrived in November of 1884, another boy, and they named him Daniel after Daniel Sixkiller, which caused that composed and contained man to step outside for a few minutes after being told and come back with his eyes slightly red and his expression firmly arranged, and James Sixkiller smiled at the floor for the rest of the day. Small Daniel was from the beginning a different character than his siblings. Robert was solemn and methodical. Eleanor was vocal and determined. Daniel was easy, sunny, the child who laughed most readily and who, from a very young age, seemed most comfortable in the middle of a crowd. The crew loved him extravagantly, which he accepted as his natural right. By 1885, the Crossfire had grown into something that would have been unrecognizable to the ranch Vernon had started with 8 years before. The operation was larger, more stable, and more deliberately structured than most comparable ranches in the territory, and Vernon had a reputation throughout the region as a man who ran a square operation and stood by his agreements, which in a world where that was not always the case was worth more than any single contract. He was also, increasingly, someone that people came to with problems. Not disputes exactly, but situations, things that needed the judgment of someone who was known to be fair. He did not seek this out, but he did not refuse it either, and Inez watched him manage it with the same quiet, unhurried care that he brought to everything, and she was proud of him in a way that she occasionally needed to say out loud. "You know I'm proud of you," she told him one evening, after he had spent 3 hours mediating a water access dispute between 2 neighboring ranch families and found them a solution that both could live with. He looked slightly uncomfortable with the statement, which was characteristic. "I just talked to them." "You listened to them," she said. "Which is different, and then you thought clearly, which is rarer than it should be." He looked at her in the firelight of the main room, the children asleep, the house quiet around them, and his expression was the full version of what she had first seen in pieces across the counter of Della's general store in Caldwell in the spring of 1878. "I would not be any of what I am now without you," he said simply. "I want you to know that." "I know it," she said, "and the same is true for me." He crossed the room to where she was sitting and sat on the arm of the chair beside her, and she leaned into him, and he put his arm around her. And the fire was warm and the night was quiet, and the Crossfire rested around them like something breathing and alive. The spring of 1886 was warm and early, and Inez stood on the porch one March morning and looked out at the territory waking up around her, the dry creek beds already running, the grass coming in green and quick, and she thought about the morning 8 years ago when she had ridden into Caldwell on a borrowed mule with a carpetbag and a stubborn heart. She thought about what she had been then, what she had known, and what she had not known. She had known how to work and how to endure. She had not known how to be found by someone who looked at her like she was worth the full effort of his attention. She had not known that a stretch of territory land with 2 dry creek beds could feel like the place she had been moving toward her whole life without knowing there was a destination. Robert came banging out the front door behind her, 6 years old and fully operational at sunrise, and pressed himself against her side. "Is Papa coming in for breakfast?" "He'll be here," she said. "He's checking the south pasture." Robert considered this and then ran off the porch toward the barn to find Louis, which was his usual morning route. Eleanor came out more slowly, 4 years old and deliberate in the way she moved, already aware of herself in a way that would serve her well when she was older, and stood beside her mother in the morning light looking out at the land with an expression that was, Inez thought, the same one Vernon wore when he looked at his ranch. "It's ours," Eleanor said, not as a question. "Yes," Inez said. "It is." Little Daniel was still asleep, which he would be until someone specifically went and retrieved him, being a child who treated mourning as optional. Vernon rode in from the south pasture before breakfast and tied his horse at the post, and came up the porch steps with the morning still on him, the cold air and the horse smell, and the unhurried certainty that was his natural way of moving through the world. He kissed Inez on the porch in front of Eleanor, who made a face, and then laughed at the face Eleanor was making. "Go wake your brother," he told Eleanor. Eleanor brightened at the authority this granted her and went immediately inside. Vernon and Inez stood on the porch for just a moment, the ranch coming alive around them, the sound of Louis and Robert at the barn and the cattle in the south corral, and somewhere behind the house Adela singing something in low Spanish. "Good morning," Vernon said to her. "Good morning," she said. He put his arm around her and they stood looking out at the crossfire together, the land golden with early light, the creek beds catching the glint of it where the water ran, the new barn solid and well-made, the bunkhouse with its thread of breakfast smoke already rising, the whole working shape of a life they had made together. He said into her hair, "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About the East Range. I think we could push the boundary another half-mile and put in a new watering station. It would improve the summer rotation," she smiled. "I've been thinking the same thing. Let's sit down with Thomas after breakfast and look at the cost." He turned her slightly toward him. "I love you, Inez." "I love you, Vernon." Eleanor's voice came from inside the house, issuing commands to Daniel in the tone of someone who has been granted legitimate authority and is taking it seriously. And Daniel's sleepy objections were clearly audible. And then Robert's voice joined from somewhere near the kitchen, suggesting that someone start the eggs, and the morning was fully, irreversibly alive. Inez looked up at Vernon, and he looked down at her, and between them was everything that 7 years of this life had put there. The hard winters and the land disputes, and the births, and the work and the evenings on the porch and the letters and the walk along the creek east of Caldwell in the spring of 1878, when neither of them had said yet what they were moving toward but both of them had known. "Come inside," she said. "The children are going to stage a revolution." He followed her inside, holding the door for her, and she walked through into the warm house full of mourning and children, and the smell of breakfast and the life she had not planned and could not have imagined and would not have traded for anything in the world. That summer of 1886, there was a celebration at the Crossfire that was not quite planned, but became one of those evenings that marks itself in a family's memory permanently. Vernon had completed the East Range expansion and the new watering station, which had gone exactly as smoothly as Inez's management of the costs had allowed. The Kansas City contract had been renewed at better terms. Louis and Clara were expecting their first child in the fall. And Daniel Sixkeller had, at some point in the process of all these good things accumulating, decided to say something to a woman named Mary Crow in the neighboring community who had been patient about him for 2 years. And she had said yes. And there was therefore both a work celebration and an engagement celebration running simultaneously. And the result was that almost everyone who had any connection to the Crossfire gathered on a July evening, and the new barn held them all. Inez stood near the barn door with a cup of punch and watched the people she loved, specifically the people she had come to love through the 8 years of building this life, and felt the particular full weight of a happiness that has been earned. Della Potts had come down from Caldwell for the week, gray-haired now but as warm and sharp as ever, and was seated in the place of honor beside Hannah Bird, the two of them conducting what appeared to be a deeply agreeable conversation. Mrs. Garfield had sent a letter she could not attend, but that was full of warmth. Thomas and Adela danced near the fiddle player, which was the same old man who had played at the Langston wedding 8 years ago. Louis was being gentle and attentive with Clara, in the particular way of a man who is newly aware of the responsibility in what is growing. Daniel Sixkiller was talking to Mary Crow with his full face open in a way that years of careful composure had never quite managed. Robert, 8 years old and entirely self-possessed, was somehow in charge of something involving the younger children and taking the responsibility with the gravity he brought to everything. Alina was dancing without a partner because she had decided she did not need one, which was the most Alina thing she had ever done. Little Daniel, 5 years old and sunny as always, was asleep against a hay bale, having decided that the party would go on without him. Vernon came and stood beside her with his own cup and looked out at the same scene. "This is ours," he said. "All of it," she agreed. He looked at her. In the warm barn light he looked the way he had looked in the dim light of Della Potts's general store, unhurried and worth the looking back. The years had set a little deeper in his face, and she knew they had done the same in hers, and she found she cared about that not at all, because the lines of a life well lived were nothing to be sorry for. "I want to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said, which was what she had said to him once on the porch of a Caldwell boarding house, and which had in the years since become a kind of standing invitation between them. "I want to say that I know how lucky I am. I want to say that every good thing in the last 8 years has been better because of you. Not easier, sometimes harder, but better, more real, more itself." He paused in the way he paused when the words mattered enough to get exactly right. "I would ride into Caldwell 100 times and walk into that store and stand in front of that counter and do all of it the same way, because it led here. To this." He gestured, meaning the barn and the people and the land and the children and all of it. "To you." Inez looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "Vernon James Langston, you chose an excellent moment to say that." "Did I?" "You did." She took his hand. "Because I have been meaning to tell you something." He was already reading her face. She watched him read it, watched the understanding come into his expression, watched that same luminous undoing she had seen twice before. "Again," he said. "April," she said. "I think April." He looked at her with everything he was, all of it at once, and then he laughed, which was one of the sounds she loved most in the world, full and genuine and rare enough to be worth the waiting for. "April," he said. "April," she confirmed. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him. And in the barn behind them the fiddle played and the people danced and the children slept against hay bales. And outside the territory night was warm and full of stars. And the crossfire rested on its land like a heart in a chest, steady and full and entirely, completely alive. The fourth child, a boy they named Thomas after the man who had been with Vernon since the beginning, arrived in April of 1887, and he was red-faced and vigorous, and gave no indication of any intention to be quiet about his arrival in the world. Louis and Clara's son, born the previous November, was named Miguel, and he and Thomas were going to grow up alongside each other the way their parents had grown up alongside each other, which seemed to everyone at the crossfire to be exactly the right shape for a life. Della Potts retired from the store in Caldwell in the spring of 1887 and announced that she intended to move to the crossfire, not as a dependent but as a paying boarder, and that if anyone had objections they could keep them. No one had objections. She arrived with a wagon load of things and a cat, and settled into the small room off the kitchen and became, almost immediately, the kind of presence that makes a home impossible to imagine without her. She and Hannah Bird ran the kitchen between them with a cheerful authority that brooked no interference. She told the children stories in the evenings that Inez suspected were partially invented, but were excellent regardless. She kept Vernon honest about his tendency to understate problems, because she had known enough men who understated problems to recognize the pattern, and she poked at him with a sharpness that he took with good grace. It was Della who said to Inez one evening, while they were sitting on the porch after the children were in bed and the summer dark was soft around the house, "You know what I think when I look at all of this?" "What?" Inez said. I think about you riding into Caldwell on that mule, Della said, with your chin up and that look you had like you were braced for everything. And I think about how you didn't need to be braced for everything. You just needed to get here. Inez looked out at the dark land. I needed to get a lot of places before here, she said. Ohio, Wichita, Caldwell. Yes, Della said, but this is where you stopped needing to go anywhere else. It was true. She had stopped somewhere along the way, in the particular sense of being somewhere that didn't require her to leave. She had built a route, or rather she and Vernon together had built one, deep and real and fed by all the honest work and love and difficulty that rooted things required. Vernon came out onto the porch, coffee in hand, and settled into the chair on the other side of Inez from Della. What are you two solving? He said. Everything, Della said. And how's it going? We've made excellent progress, Inez said. He smiled, the full version, and Della took her coffee and stood up and said she was going inside to read, and left the two of them on the porch in the warm August night, which Inez suspected was entirely intentional. Vernon set his coffee down and reached over for her hand, and she gave it to him, and they sat in the dark without talking for a while, listening to the land, the cattle and the insects and the distant creek and the breathing quiet of the territory at night. What are you thinking? He asked eventually. I'm thinking about 8 years, she said. 8 years of what? Of this, she said. Of you, of us, of the crossfire. Of Robert and Alina and Daniel and Thomas, of everyone out here. 8 years is not very long in the scale of things, but it's long enough to know. To know what? She looked at him in the dark. This man she had walked toward across the muddy main street of Caldwell and through every season since. This man who looked at her with the full effort of his attention and had told her he would be careful with her happiness and had been. That this is the whole story, she said. Not a part of it. Not the beginning of something else. This is the thing itself. He turned her hand over in his, the way he sometimes did, tracing the lines of her palm with his thumb in a gesture that was entirely private and entirely theirs. Yes, he said, it is. The stars held their positions over the territory, as they always did, indifferent to the small and enormous lives playing out beneath them. And the crossfire rested on the land it had grown from, and in the house behind the porch, the children slept their deep child sleep, and in the cabin nearby Louis and Clara's lamplight was still on, and somewhere in the dark the creek ran quietly over its stones. Inez Maddox Langston held her husband's hand on the porch of the life she had made and let the night move around her and was entirely, unreservedly, completely at peace. She had ridden into Caldwell on a borrowed mule with a stubborn heart that refused to quit, and the heart had been right. She did not need to borrow anything anymore. She was, and had been for 8 years, exactly where she was meant to be. That was enough. That was everything. That was the whole, good, complete, unambiguous shape of her life. And she held it without fear, without reserve, without any wish that it were otherwise. For there was nothing otherwise that could have touched it. The territory night breathed around them. The stars burned above the open grass, and Vernon and Inez sat together on the porch of the crossfire in the way of people who have no need to go anywhere, because they have already arrived.